Mom, you're hurting her. The boy's voice cracked as he tried to pull the man's hand away, but the man didn't even look at him. He only tightened his grip on the woman's arm. You don't get to disappear with my son, Megan. He said it calmly. Too calmly. Right there in the middle of a crowded Chicago sidewalk, the woman tried to pull free. Victor, please, you're scaring him. The boy hid behind her coat, trembling. People slowed down. Some stopped walking. Phones quietly appeared in hands, but no one stepped forward, because the man grabbing her didn't look desperate. He looked powerful, the kind of powerful that makes strangers suddenly remember they have somewhere else to be. Then the boy screamed. Victor Langston had grabbed his arm too. Across the street, an engine continued to idle. A long black luxury car sat perfectly still beside the curb. Dark windows, running engine, waiting, inside the car. Someone had been watching the entire time, watching Victor, watching the terrified child, watching the woman trying not to cry. And when the boy screamed, the driver inside the car slowly turned his head toward the man sitting in the back seat, waiting, because the man sitting there had one rule, a rule he had never broken. He never interfered in family matters, not once, not ever. But the moment Victor Langston dragged that child closer, the back door of the black car quietly unlocked. The man inside leaned forward slightly, because Victor Langston had just made the worst mistake of his life. He did it in front of the wrong witness. But the truth is, this story didn't start that afternoon. Oh, before we continue, let me say something quickly. If you believe powerful people should never be allowed to bully the vulnerable, and that sometimes the right person appears at exactly the right moment, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now, because stories like this remind us of something important. Even when the world feels unfair, even when powerful people think no one will challenge them, sometimes someone is watching. And when that person finally decides to stand up, everything changes. Now let me explain how Megan Sullivan ended up on that sidewalk with Victor Langston holding her arm. Because for years, she had been hiding in plain sight. I work at a small coffee shop on the corner of West Monroe Street. It's the kind of place where regulars become part of your daily routine. You start to notice things about people, their habits, their moods, their stories. And Megan Sullivan had been part of that routine for almost 3 years. Every morning at exactly 7:40, the door would open. Megan would walk in quickly, holding her son's hand. Matthew Parker, 7 years old. Quiet kid, very polite. "Morning, Mr. Kyle," he would say every day when he came in. Most kids barely look at the person making their hot chocolate. Matthew always remembered my name. Megan would order the same thing every morning. Medium coffee, 1 cream, no sugar. Then she would sit at the same table near the window, always the same seat, always facing the door. I didn't think much about it at first. Chicago is a busy city. People like to keep an eye on their surroundings. But after a while, I started noticing other small things. Megan always checked outside before leaving. She scanned the street like she was looking for someone, or making sure someone wasn't there. Matthew stayed very close to her, closer than most kids his age. Sometimes he held onto her sleeve even while sitting. One morning about a year ago, I overheard something that stuck with me. Matthew was drawing dinosaurs on a napkin. He looked up at Megan and asked quietly, "Mom, he can't find us here, right?" Megan froze, just for a second. Then she forced a gentle smile. "No one is looking for us, sweetheart." Matthew nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. Back then I assumed it was just a bad memory, maybe a difficult family situation, but I never imagined the truth. Because the man now standing on the sidewalk outside my cafe was Victor Langston. And Victor Langston wasn't just a jealous ex. He was something much worse. Victor Langston was rich, powerfully rich, the kind of rich that comes with influence, connections, protection, the kind of rich that makes problems disappear quietly. People in Chicago knew the name, even if they pretended they didn't. Victor owned businesses, real estate, political connections. If Victor Langston wanted something, he usually got it. And today, He wanted Megan back. Outside the cafe window, Victor still held Megan's arm. His grip looked painful. "Megan," he said calmly, "you embarrassed me." Megan shook her head. "I left you," she said quietly. "You don't own me." Victor smiled again, but it wasn't a friendly smile. You took my son." Matthew immediately moved behind her again. Victor glanced down at him. "So this is him," Victor said. Matthew hid his face in Megan's coat. Victor crouched slightly, his voice softened. "You know who I am." Matthew shook his head. Victor smiled. "I'm your father." Matthew immediately started crying. "No!" He clung tighter to Megan. "Mom said you're dangerous." Victor's smile faded, just a little. Then it returned, colder than before. "You've been lying to him," Victor said to Megan. "No," Megan whispered. "I've been protecting him." Victor stood up again. Around them, people whispered nervously, but no one moved closer. Victor leaned toward Megan. "You thought you could run forever?" Megan didn't answer. Victor suddenly grabbed Matthew's arm again. The boy screamed. "Stop!" Megan cried. Yes, Victor ignored her. "You're coming home," he said coldly, and that was the moment something changed across the street, because the black car door finally opened. A polished shoe stepped onto the pavement, then another. A tall man stepped out slowly, calmly. He adjusted his coat. And the strange thing was, 3 men nearby suddenly shifted positions. One stepped away from a newspaper stand. Another stopped pretending to check his phone. A third leaned against a parked SUV. All of them watched the same thing. Victor Langston, the tall man from the black car, began walking across the street, unhurried, silent. Victor didn't notice him at first. He was still focused on Megan. "You made me look weak," Victor said quietly. "You don't get to do that." Then a calm voice spoke behind him. "Let her go." Victor turned, annoyed, ready to insult whoever had interrupted him, but the moment he saw the man standing there, Victor Langston's expression changed, just slightly. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition. The kind of recognition powerful men have when they suddenly realize they may have pushed too far. Victor studied the stranger carefully. "This isn't your business," Victor said coldly. The stranger's voice remained calm. "You made it my business." Victor laughed quietly. "You're protecting a runaway and a child thief." The stranger didn't respond. He simply looked at Megan, then at Matthew, then back at Victor. Victor narrowed his eyes. "You have no idea who you're interfering with." The stranger finally spoke again. "Oh," he said softly, "I know exactly who you are." Victor stared at him. And for the first time that afternoon, Victor Langston looked uncertain because he recognized the man standing in front of him, and that realization brought a new problem. Victor had just threatened a woman in front of a man who controlled far more of Chicago than anyone liked to admit. But Victor wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. So he made the worst possible decision. He reached for Matthew again, and the stranger's expression changed. Very slightly, but enough to tell anyone watching that something dangerous was about to happen. Victor just touched the child again, in front of the one man in Chicago who never interferes in family matters. Victor's hand tightened around Matthew's sleeve. The boy cried out and tried to pull free. For a moment, everything on the sidewalk seemed to pause. Cars rolled past at the intersection. A bus hissed as its doors opened down the street. Someone laughed outside a nearby store. But the small circle around Victor, Megan, and the child felt strangely still. The stranger in the black car continued watching. He had not stepped out yet. He had not spoken. But something in his expression had shifted. Victor didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on Megan. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," he said in the same calm voice. Megan stepped in front of Matthew again. Her body moved on instinct. "You're not taking him," she said quietly. Victor tilted his head as if the answer amused him. "You still believe you get to decide that?" Matthew clung to Megan's coat, burying his face against her side. Across the street. The stranger stayed silent, watching, studying. Because before the moment could move forward, there was something about Megan Sullivan that nobody on that sidewalk knew. Something that explained the fear in her eyes. Something that explained why she had disappeared for 7 years, and why seeing Victor Langston again looked like she had just seen a ghost. 7 years earlier, Megan's life had been very different. Back then, she wasn't hiding. She didn't check reflections in windows when she walked. She didn't glance over her shoulder at every bus stop. In those days, Megan believed Victor Langston was the best thing that had ever happened to her. They met at a charity fundraiser in downtown Chicago. Victor arrived late. People noticed immediately when he entered the room. Tall, confident, perfect suit. The kind of man people moved aside for without thinking. Megan was helping organize the event. She stood behind a table near the entrance, handing out programs. Victor walked over and gave her a small smile. "You look like the only person here who actually knows what's going on," he said. Megan laughed awkwardly. "I'm trying my best." Victor stayed and talked with her. Not just for a minute, almost an hour. He asked about her work, where she grew up, what she wanted to do with her life. Most people at those events talked about themselves. Victor listened, or at least it seemed like he did. When the night ended, he gave her his number. The next morning, flowers arrived at her apartment. A few days later, they went to dinner, then another dinner, then weekends together. Victor seemed thoughtful, charming, generous, and powerful. Megan didn't realize how dangerous that power could be. Not in the beginning. At first, the changes were small. Victor started asking questions, simple ones. Who were you talking to? Why didn't you answer your phone earlier? Where did you go after work? Megan thought it was normal. Maybe he was just protective. Maybe he cared. But the questions slowly became something else. Victor didn't like when Megan went out with friends. He didn't like when she stayed late at work. He didn't like when she disagreed with him. Victor Langston was not used to hearing the word no. The first time Megan saw his temper was almost a year after they met. They were eating dinner at a restaurant. The place was busy and loud. A waiter accidentally spilled a little wine on Victor's sleeve. The room went quiet. Victor didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. He simply looked at the young waiter. His voice stayed low. "You've made a very expensive mistake," Victor said. The waiter apologized quickly. The manager rushed over. Within minutes, the young man was gone. Fired. Just like that. Megan tried to brush it off later. "It was an accident," she said. Victor looked at her. Accidents still have consequences. The way he said it made Megan uncomfortable, but she pushed the feeling away. She wanted to believe the man she cared about was still the one who sent flowers. Then Matthew was born. For a while, Victor seemed happy. He bought a large house, expensive toys, private doctors, anything money could provide. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But Victor's control only grew stronger. He wanted the house quiet when he worked. He wanted every room in order. He wanted schedules followed exactly, and when something didn't go the way he expected, his calm voice turned cold. Very cold. The night Megan decided to leave came during Matthew's first birthday party. Friends had gathered at the house. The living room was full of laughter. Music played softly in the background. Matthew sat in his high chair with cake all over his hands and face. Everyone laughed. Everyone except Victor. Megan noticed him standing near the doorway, watching. His expression wasn't warm. It wasn't proud. It was annoyed. Later that night, after everyone left, Victor asked Megan to come into his office. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said. Megan frowned. "What are you talking about?" Victor leaned back in his chair. You turned my house into chaos." "It was Matthew's birthday," she replied. Victor's eyes hardened. "You will not turn my home into a circus again." Megan stared at him. For the first time in their relationship, she didn't stay quiet. "He's a baby, Victor." Victor slowly stood up. The look in his eyes changed. "You forget who provides everything here," he said. Megan felt a chill run down her spine. At that moment, something became clear. Victor didn't see their life as a family. He saw it as something he owned. The house, the money, the life they lived. In Victor's mind, it all belonged to him, including Megan, including Matthew. That night, Megan waited until Victor fell asleep. Then she packed a bag. She carried Matthew out of the house before sunrise, and she left. No goodbye, no warning. She simply disappeared. Now, 7 years later, Megan stood on the sidewalk facing him again. Victor still held Matthew's sleeve. "You ran very far," Victor said calmly, "but not far enough." Megan swallowed. "You haven't changed." Victor smiled slightly. "I didn't need to." Matthew tried to pull free again. "Mom." Across the street, the stranger in the black car watched closely. He had seen many situations like this, arguments, threats, power struggles, but something about this one felt different. It was the way the boy trembled, the way Megan moved without thinking to protect him, and the way Victor looked at them, not like people, like possessions. The stranger breathed out slowly. One of the men standing nearby glanced toward the car, waiting, but the stranger didn't give an order. Not yet. Because the rule still stood. He didn't interfere in family matters. Ever. Victor leaned closer to Megan. He spoke quietly so no one else could hear. Whatever he said made Megan's face lose color. Her shoulders stiffened. Matthew began crying harder. Across the street, the stranger's eyes narrowed slightly, because whatever Victor had just said had changed something. And on that quiet Chicago sidewalk, a rule that had never been broken before was beginning to crack. Victor just whispered something to Megan that turned her face pale, and the man watching from the black car may finally be ready to step in. Victor leaned closer to Megan so only she could hear him. "You really thought you could keep him away from me forever?" he said quietly. Megan felt the color drain from her face. Victor noticed immediately. He always noticed things like that. A small smile appeared on his lips. "I told you once," he continued softly. "Everything that belongs to me eventually finds its way back." Megan tightened her grip on Matthew's shoulders. The boy was still crying. He didn't understand the details of what was happening, but he understood enough to know something was wrong. His mother was scared, and he had never seen her like that before. "Mom, I want to go home," Matthew said through shaky breaths. Megan brushed a hand over his hair. "We will," she whispered. Victor adjusted the sleeve of his expensive coat, looking perfectly calm, as if the entire situation was completely normal. People nearby were definitely watching now. A man slowed down while walking his dog. 2 teenagers across the street pretended to look at their phones. But nobody stepped forward. Victor wasn't surprised. Men like Victor Langston rarely got challenged. He had too much influence, too much money, too many people who owed him favors. In Chicago, that combination usually meant you got your way. Victor slipped his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. Then he held it out in front of Megan. "Take a look," he said. Megan glanced down. Her stomach twisted instantly. Legal documents, custody filings, law firm headers. Victor studied her reaction carefully. "I've been preparing for this for a while," he said. "You can't just do that," Megan replied quietly. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I absolutely can." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Judges like stability," he continued. "They like money. They like powerful fathers who can provide." His voice remained calm. "And I happen to have all 3. Matthew sniffed and wiped his eyes. Victor finally looked down at the boy. For a brief moment, his expression softened. But it wasn't kindness. It was something else. something colder. "You've gotten big," Victor said. Matthew quickly stepped back behind Megan. Victor sighed as if the reaction disappointed him. "Your mother has been telling you some very strange stories about me, hasn't she?" Matthew didn't answer. He just clung tighter to Megan's coat. Across the street, inside the black car. The man watching hadn't missed any of it. He had seen arguments before. He had seen threats. He had seen people lose control in public. But this situation was different. The fear in the boy's eyes was real. The way Megan instinctively moved to protect him for several seconds. No one moved. Victor stood facing the man who had stepped out of the black car. The stranger didn't look angry. He didn't look nervous either. He just stood there calmly, hands relaxed at his sides. But something about the way he carried himself made the moment feel heavier. Victor tried to take control of the situation again. He straightened his jacket and gave a short, unimpressed smile. "You're getting involved in something that doesn't concern you," he said. The stranger didn't answer right away. His eyes moved slowly, first toward Megan, then toward Matthew. The boy was still clinging tightly to his mother, his face pressed against her coat. His small shoulders were shaking from crying. The stranger looked back at Victor. "Let her go," he said quietly. Victor let out a short laugh. "That's not going to happen." The stranger's voice stayed calm. "It should." Victor folded his arms. "This is a family matter." The stranger tilted his head slightly. "Not anymore." Victor frowned. He didn't like the tone of that answer. He glanced around the sidewalk again. That was when he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. A few people who had been standing nearby were still there. They hadn't left. In fact, some of them had moved closer. A man near the bus stop had stepped off the curb. Another leaned casually against a parked car, watching. None of them looked directly at the stranger, but their attention seemed connected to him somehow. Victor turned back to the man in front of him. "Do you know who I am?" Victor asked. The stranger nodded once. "Yes." Victor seemed satisfied with that. "Then you understand why this conversation should end right now." The stranger took a single step forward. It wasn't aggressive, but Victor noticed it immediately. "You're hurting a child," the stranger said. Victor scoffed. "I'm dealing with a problem that should have been solved years ago." Matthew tightened his grip on Megan. The boy tried to hide behind her again. Megan's heart was racing. She still didn't know who the stranger was, but the moment he had stepped onto the sidewalk, something about the situation had shifted. Victor wasn't acting as confident as before, and that alone made her feel a little safer. Victor looked between Megan and the stranger. "You're defending a woman who kidnapped my son," he said. The stranger glanced at Megan. "Is that what happened?" Megan shook her head immediately. "No," she said quickly. "I left because he—" Victor cut her off before she could finish. "You left because you're unstable." The stranger's eyes returned to Victor. "You talk a lot." Victor's patience was beginning to wear thin. "You have no idea what you're stepping into." The stranger didn't argue. He simply stood there quietly, and somehow that silence was more unsettling than any threat. Across the street, the door of the black SUV opened. Two men stepped out and spread along the sidewalk. They moved slowly, like people who weren't in a hurry. Victor's guards noticed them. One of Victor's men shifted uncomfortably. The feeling on the street was changing. Victor tried to ignore it. "This situation is already being handled legally," he said. The stranger raised an eyebrow. "Then let the court deal with it." Victor smiled thinly. "That's exactly what I plan to do." He glanced at Megan. "And when that happens, my son will be coming home with me." Matthew pressed his face against Megan's coat again. The stranger watched the boy for a moment, then he looked back at Victor. "Let go of him." Victor's grip tightened slightly. "I don't take orders from strangers." The stranger nodded slowly. "That's your choice." Victor stepped a little closer. "You're making this into a bigger problem than it needs to be." The stranger's voice remained steady. "You did that yourself." Victor leaned forward slightly. And what exactly are you going to do about it? For a moment, the entire street went quiet. Even the traffic nearby seemed distant. Then the stranger answered. That depends on you. Victor laughed. You think you're intimidating? The stranger didn't reply. Instead, he turned his head slightly. It was a small movement, but several of the men standing nearby noticed immediately. Victor's guards noticed too. And suddenly they realized something uncomfortable. They weren't standing freely anymore. 3 men had stepped into the street behind them. Another leaned casually near the corner. The path out had quietly closed. Victor slowly looked around. You planned this? He asked. The stranger shook his head. No. Victor frowned. Then what is it? The stranger answered calmly. This is my street. Victor let out a sharp breath. You expect me to believe that? The stranger shrugged. You don't have to believe it. Victor studied him carefully now. Something about the man felt familiar. The calm voice, the quiet confidence. Victor searched his memory, and then it hit him. A name, a reputation, a man people rarely saw in person. Victor's expression changed slightly. The stranger noticed. You know who I am, he said. Victor didn't answer, but the silence confirmed it. Megan looked between the 2 men, confused. She had no idea what was happening. The stranger spoke again. You made a mistake today. Victor raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? Yes. The stranger nodded toward Matthew. You frightened a child. Victor scoffed. That's hardly a crime. The stranger's voice stayed even. No. He paused briefly. But it is a problem. Victor shook his head. You're defending people you don't even know. The stranger glanced once more at Megan and Matthew. That doesn't matter. Victor frowned. Then what does? The stranger answered simply. Respect. Victor stared at him. You're serious? Yes. Victor exhaled slowly. You've said your piece. Now step aside. The stranger didn't move. Victor's tone hardened. I'm warning you. The stranger looked at him steadily. And I'm done warning you. The tension snapped. Victor's guards moved forward, but they didn't get far. The men around them stepped in immediately, blocking their path. The movement happened so quickly it caught Victor's men off guard. Within seconds, they realized they were surrounded. Victor looked around. His guards couldn't move. They were outnumbered. For the first time that afternoon, Victor slowly released Matthew's arm. The boy ran straight back to Megan. She wrapped both arms around him, holding him tightly. Victor's face hardened, but he was thinking now, calculating. The stranger stepped a little closer. If you come near them again, he said quietly, Chicago will become very small for you. Victor held his gaze for a moment, then he stepped back. Once, then again. He turned toward his men. Let's go. They didn't argue. Victor walked toward the corner, his guards following. He didn't look back, but the anger in his expression was clear. The street slowly began to relax. The tension faded. Cars moved again. People started walking like nothing had happened. Megan stood there, still holding Matthew. Her hands were shaking. The stranger turned toward them. Matthew peeked out from behind his mother. The stranger crouched slightly so he was closer to the boy's height. You're all right, he said gently. Matthew nodded, still quiet. The stranger stood again. Megan finally spoke. Thank you, she said softly. The stranger gave a small nod. Then he turned and walked back toward the black car. Matthew suddenly called out, Sir? The stranger stopped and looked back. Matthew looked up at him. Why did you help us? The stranger thought for a moment. Then he gave a simple answer. Because some rules aren't worth keeping. He opened the car door, but Megan watched him carefully. One thought stayed in her mind. She still didn't know the name of the man who had just protected her son. But judging by the way Victor had reacted, he definitely did. Megan still doesn't know who the stranger is, but Victor clearly recognized him the moment he stepped out of that car. Victor Langston walked away without saying another word. His guards followed him down the sidewalk, keeping a few steps behind. None of them looked happy anymore. The confidence they had earlier was gone. Victor's car waited half a block away. When he reached it, one of the guards opened the door for him, but Victor didn't get inside right away. Instead, he stopped and turned slightly. Looking back down the street, Megan was still standing there, holding Matthew tightly in her arms. A few steps away, the stranger stood beside the black car he had stepped out of earlier. Even from a distance, Victor could feel the man watching him. Victor's jaw tightened. He had spent most of his life making other people back down. Money handled most problems. Power handled the rest. Very few people ever challenged him in public. But the man who had just stepped into the middle of that street was not someone Victor could easily push aside. Victor knew exactly who he was. Most people in Chicago had never seen the man before. Many had never even heard his name. But the ones who moved in certain circles knew better. They knew there were lines you didn't cross in this city, certain businesses you didn't interfere with, certain streets you didn't control, and certain men you didn't provoke. Victor looked one last time at the man standing beside the black car. Then he got inside his vehicle. The door shut. The engine started. Within seconds, the car pulled into traffic and disappeared down the street. Back on the sidewalk, Megan slowly released the breath she had been holding. Her heart was still racing. Matthew clung to her like he was afraid she might disappear. "Is he gone?" Matthew asked quietly. Megan looked down the street where Victor's car had vanished. "Yes," she said gently. "He's gone." Matthew nodded and leaned his head against her shoulder. She could still feel his small body trembling slightly. Across the sidewalk, the stranger had already turned toward his car. He moved the same way he had earlier, calm, steady, like the entire confrontation had never really worried him. Megan watched him carefully. Something about him made it clear that the situation had changed the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk. Matthew lifted his head. "Mom?" "Yes?" "That man helped us," Megan nodded. "Yes, he did." Matthew hesitated for a moment. "Should we say thank you again?" Megan smiled faintly. "I think we already did." But as she watched the stranger reach the car, she realized something. She didn't even know his name. The man opened the rear door of the black car. Before stepping inside, he paused. His eyes moved briefly toward Megan and Matthew. Matthew raised his hand and gave a small wave. The man looked at the boy for a moment. Then he gave a quiet nod. Nothing dramatic, just a small gesture. Then he stepped into the car. The door closed behind him. The engine started a moment later, and the black car pulled away from the curb. Matthew watched it disappear. "Who was he?" the boy asked. Megan shook her head slowly. I don't know, but someone nearby did. The coffee shop employee who had been watching everything from inside finally stepped outside. He approached Megan carefully. "Are you okay?" he asked. Megan nodded. "I think so." The man looked down the street where the black car had gone. "You know who that was, right?" Megan frowned. "No." The employee looked surprised. "You really don't?" She shook her head again. The man lowered his voice a little. "Well, the guy who just helped you doesn't usually step into situations like that." Trace. Megan felt a slight chill run through her. "What do you mean?" The employee glanced around before answering. "Let's just say people in this city are usually a lot more afraid of him than they are of someone like Victor." Megan didn't know how to respond to that. "Who is he?" she asked. The employee shrugged. "I don't think people say his name out loud very often." Matthew tugged gently on Megan's sleeve. "Mom? Yes? Can we go home now?" Megan nodded right away. "Yes, let's go home." They walked slowly toward the bus stop. Matthew held her hand the entire way, across the city streets. The black car moved smoothly through traffic. Inside the back seat, the stranger sat quietly, looking out the window. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. "You broke your rule today," the driver said. The stranger didn't answer right away. He watched the buildings pass by outside. For years, he had avoided getting involved in situations like that. Family disputes were messy, emotional, unpredictable. It was easier to stay out of them. But today had been different. The driver spoke again. You know people are going to hear about this." The stranger nodded slightly. "I know." The driver hesitated before asking another question. Was it worth it? For a moment, the stranger stayed silent. Then he thought about the boy hiding behind his mother. He thought about the fear on Megan's face and the way Victor had grabbed that child like he owned him. "Finally," he answered. "Yes." The car continued moving through the city. Behind them, the street where everything happened had already returned to normal. People walked past the coffee shop like nothing unusual had taken place. Cars passed through the intersection. Life moved on. But moments like that didn't disappear completely. They turned into stories. Later that evening, inside the coffee shop, the employee who had watched the entire confrontation was telling the story to one of his coworkers. "You should have seen Victor's face," he said. The coworker looked curious. "What happened?" The employee leaned closer. "Victor Langston picked the worst possible witness." The coworker frowned. "What do you mean?" The employee gave a quiet laugh. "The guy who stepped out of that car..." He paused for a second. "He's the one man in Chicago who never interferes in family problems." The coworker blinked. "So why did he?" The employee shrugged. "Maybe Victor scared the wrong kid." Outside, the city lights began to glow as night settled over Chicago. Traffic continued moving through the streets. People hurried home from work. And somewhere in the city, a man who rarely involved himself in other people's lives had quietly broken one of his oldest rules. Not for power, not for business, but because sometimes a moment comes along when doing nothing simply isn't an option. Sometimes the people who change our lives are complete strangers. They appear in a moment when everything feels hopeless and remind us that someone is still willing to stand up and do the right thing. Maybe you've seen something like that before. Maybe someone stepped in for you when you needed it most. If you've experienced a moment like that, feel free to share your story in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that courage and protection still exist in the world, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video so more people can hear them. Because sometimes the smallest act of standing up for someone else can make a bigger difference than we realize. Wherever you are, I hope you are surrounded by people who protect you when it matters most. This is the Protector's Oath, where fear ends and protection begins.